Hey everyone, and welcome to this month's live event for National Sewing Circle. We once again have Nikki LaFoyle back to answer all of your sewing questions. So thanks for being here, Nikki.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here.
Of course. All right. So Nikki's going to answer your sewing questions. So of course, if you have any sewing questions, please ask them to her. If you are on Facebook or YouTube, go ahead and just type those into the comment section or question section. If you're watching on the site, we kind of have two different chat boxes, and make sure you're entering it into the largest of those two chat boxes. That's under the banner. That's the one that we're going to see live right now. The other one, we still will, get to them, but those get emailed to us at a later date. So make sure you're using the large one to get your questions to Nikki. So the first one we're going to talk about is zippers. Somebody has some questions about zippers. So in general, what is some tips for zipper insertion and sort of how to choose the right zipper for a project?
Yeah, so zippers can be a little intimidating because you go to the store and there's like a million different kinds. But there are a couple of basic kinds of zippers and a couple of different techniques for installing them. So your regular coil zipper can come in with plastic teeth or with metal teeth. So I like the plastic teeth variety just because I can cut it with my scissors to whatever length I want. You can shorten a metal zipper, but it requires some extra tools, just pliers, to pull off those metal teeth so that you can cut the zipper to whatever length you want. And then you have your invisible zipper, which the coils don't show on the right side. The coils kind of roll under so that the tape meets at the top, so it can be hidden within the seam, hence the name invisible zipper. So for the regular zipper, it's really easy to install. You baste your seam first, baste the seam that you want the zipper inserted into, and then lay your coil centered along that seam so that the seam meets exactly in the center of that coil. And you can pin your zipper down, but sometimes pins, they warp the fabric and it's kind of hard to pin through that thick twill tape that they use for zipper tape. So a lot of people like to use tape, like Scotch tape, to tape their zippers down, or even temporary adhesive of some sort to adhere that zipper down. And then you throw a zipper foot on your machine, and the zipper foot, it allows your needle to get closer to the coil of the zipper than your regular presser foot. So zipper foot, they come in some different types, but this is what mine looks like. So this is my zipper foot. So I hook my bar onto one side of this so that this edge can get really close to my coil of my zipper. So you don't have, a huge amount of fabric between your seam and the center of your zipper. It just looks nicer. And then using your zipper foot, you just essentially stitch a box around your zipper, making sure to, when you stitch across that zipper coil, I like to walk my needle across the coil, because even if you're using a plastic coil zipper, if that needle hits that coil just right, or if you have a zipper stop on the bottom of your zipper, if your needle hits that metal zipper stop, you're definitely going to break your needle. So be really careful, walk your zipper or walk your needle as you are stitching across the coil. And it's helpful a lot of times when you are stitching, when you're stitching back up toward the zipper pull, to stop and pull your zipper down. A lot of people do, so that you don't have to stitch around the zipper head, the zipper pull, because the zipper pull is wider than the coil. So a lot of times at the top of the zipper, sometimes you'll get that Y seam because your zipper foot is getting pushed away from the zipper pull because it is wider. And that's okay if you get that. But to make a really neat, straight box around your zipper, you have to kind of stop and then pull that zipper pull out of the way and then start again. So it can be a little bit tricky. And then your invisible zipper is inserted slightly differently, but it is also super easy. You don't sew your seam before you install your invisible zipper. You install each side of the zipper to the separate pieces of fabric, and then stitch your seam after that. So They have a foot called an invisible zipper foot. You don't necessarily need to use it, but it is helpful because it helps roll that coil out so that you stitch right underneath the coil so that when you zip that zipper up, it closes that seam right up. You don't necessarily need to use it, but it can be helpful. When I'm installing an invisible zipper, I like to take an iron on a low heat and press that coil open so you can kind of so you unzip your zipper and you kind of roll that coil out, and give it just a little press to help it stay open. And that allows you to get your needle right underneath that coil. So you line up your coil with your seam line, stitch that coil down, do that on both sides, zip your zipper up, and then stitch the rest of the seam underneath the zipper, pulling that zipper tail out of the way. So it's super easy to install. I probably have some videos on National Sewing Circle demonstrating it, since I don't have any with me right here to demo for you, but there are resources out there so you can get a visual.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you did just steal my line because I like to say we have a video, and not only do we have a video, but Nikki did the video for us on National Sewing Circle specifically for that invisible zipper. So if you've put one in before but never done the little tip of rolling it open and pressing it, like that little tiny thing is going to make it look that much nicer when you actually get it in, because it's tiniest amount, but it kind of makes a big difference. So I know that was a lot of information on zippers, so not necessarily answering this again, but Grace wants to know, she's putting a zipper into a duvet cover. So just which type of zipper of the ones you just talked about would you recommend specifically for that project?
Right. So in a duvet cover, I would recommend probably a coil zipper, plastic coil, because you want it to be comfortable and flexible to be able to move with the blanket. And metal coil zippers a lot of times are heavier, and I wouldn't want a metal zipper in my
Yeah.
blankets.
I
So
think of like metal zippers as like jeans, like heavy
yeah,
duty, heavy upholstery, maybe something. But yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So also,
Perfect.
I know I
Yeah.
didn't really answer the first question. I just talked about zippers for 8 minutes. Um, but so determining what type of zipper to choose for what project. So
Mhm. Yeah.
um, invisible zippers are really nice for like skirts, like a side seam on a skirt or something where you want it to be invisible, or trousers or something. Um, they do make zippers specifically for like jackets. So they make the zippers that come undone at the top and the bottom. So that is specifically for jackets or like sleeping bags that you want to be able to unzip it and lay it out.
Yeah.
And like you said, metal zippers are great for jeans, can be great for some jackets as well. Heavier duty type things. They also make zippers that have really, really light zipper tape, which
Mhm.
is great for inserting into like formal wear, or if you've got like a dance wear or something and you want to insert the zipper into a really fine fabric, fine, maybe even sheer. They make zippers with that type of zipper tape that so they won't be stiff, they won't be super noticeable, um, and they're a little bit lighter weight. But for 99% of my projects, I'm good with just a regular coil, plastic coil zipper.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only other zipper I can think of that you didn't mention, just because like there's one other zipper out there, are the ones that have the decorative tapes. And those ones are even, I think, some of the easiest to install because you're not trying to hide anything. You specifically want that zipper tape on the outside, and you pretty much just like stick it on there and you're good to go. Yeah.
Nice.
So there's a zipper for everything. Perfect. Another question here. Leanne wants to know, what is the best way to hem curtains?
So hemming curtains, so the hem at the bottom of a curtain, uh, generally you like it to be a nice deep hem, because it adds weight to the bottom of the curtain and allows everything to, hang nice and flat and, kind of pull it down at the bottom so that it just hangs nice. So I actually I extended the curtains in my daughter's room because the curtains I bought were too short for her window. So I just added a panel at the bottom. So when I hemmed that panel, I did, I think, 2 inch or 2.5 inch hem at the bottom. So I folded the lower edge 1/2 inch toward the wrong side, and then I folded it again 2 inches. So I got that 2 inch hem at the bottom, and then I just edge stitched that first fold. So I got my nice top stitching line 2 inches from the bottom. And I hemmed, so you want to hem the side edges first if you're not lining it or anything, you're just doing one panel. So I hemmed the side edges and then I did the lower hem, and it's super easy.
Perfect. And you mentioned the very first thing you mentioned was like adding weight to your curtains or your drapes. And so that is something, we have a video on National Sewing Circle. Another one of our instructors, DJ Humbach, talks about actually using drapery weights. So they make weights that are meant for drapes, and I'm going to say, remind me of like a washer at a hardware store, but they are, heavy, and she explains how you can actually add those into your hem. So if the fabric you're using, if it's just not hanging the way you want it to, you can weight it down so that it does. So that's perfect. Next one here, Consuelo wants to know, making your own binding with a clean look. How do you do that?
Yeah, so I always make my own binding. I don't ever buy pre-made bias binding from the store because I like to match my binding to my project.
Mhm.
And making your own binding is super easy. You can do it in a couple different ways. So you can just cut bias strips and attach the short ends and then fold them. You can also do something called continuous bias binding, which I have a video on. There's a little bit of math involved. So you determine how much binding you need to determine how big of a square you want to cut. And then you do some, nifty sewing and cutting, and you can create one long strip of binding from that. Or you can just cut bias strips, which is what I do a lot of times. It's still quick and easy. Continuous bias binding is quicker and easier. But it's just, I have more practice doing it, kind of the manual way. So I just usually cut bias binding strip or bias strips, and I attach the ends using the L seam. So the ends, you line up like that and stitch across, and then press them open. And so you can, depending if you're doing single fold or double fold, I usually do double fold. So I fold my binding in half lengthwise and press it, open it up, fold the long edges in to meet at the center, and press again. Or you can use a bias binding maker, which I probably don't have at the ready, but it's a little tool that you thread your binding strip through, and it's like a little C on the inside, like a little seashell, and it curves your fabric for you. So it curves it in. So you get those outer folds pre-made for you. And you just have to make sure you keep the cut edges, the cut long edges of your binding meeting in the center. And there's a mark on the tool for you to align those edges with as you're pulling it out of as you're pulling the tool along the strip of binding, and press it as you go. And then you can fold it in half, centered, to finish it off and give it a good press. So that's super easy to do. And then to attach the binding, you can attach binding in different ways, depending on what you're making. So a lot of quilters like to use single fold binding, which is just a binding strip folded in half once. And then they stitch both of the layers of binding to the raw edge of the quilt, and then fold that over so that you have, so that you're then stitching that folded edge to the wrong side of the fabric. And having those two layers of fabric encasing the raw edges of your quilt offer a little more protection, as to protect those edges as you're using the quilt and washing it. So it'll be good and strong for the life of the quilt. For my projects, whenever I bind like a neckline or whatever, I use that double fold binding. So making it as I mentioned, and then unfolding everything, and I line up the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of my neckline and stitch in the fold line of the first fold, and then everything just gets folded over to the back. And then I like to stitch in the ditch from the right side to catch that fold on the wrong side. A lot of people will hand stitch the binding on the wrong side if you want, and that is a good invisible way to attach your binding. But if you don't mind having that seam line, and if you're stitching in the ditch, it is kind of invisible, but also you can see it on the wrong side, and there's a chance that your stitches aren't going to be perfectly in the ditch and it will be a little bit visible. I'm always okay with that, but you can choose whatever method you want, um, depending on your project and how you want it to look at the end. But I just choose a matching thread and stitch in the ditch, and you just have to make sure that you have folded the binding over enough so that your stitching in the ditch from the right side will catch the fold on the wrong side. It's a point of frustration a lot of times when you're sewing. You stitch in the ditch for the whole thing, and then you turn it over and you're like, oh, I missed the fold on the wrong side here, here, and here. I've got to go and redo it.
Mm-hmm.
So one way to make sure you catch that fold is to make sure when you're folding it over, you fold it over enough so that the edge that you're encasing sits right in the middle of the fabric. You don't have, the binding should be full of that fabric that you're encasing. And there's no empty spots or empty pockets in the binding. And when you're pinning it, I use a lot of pins when I'm binding to make sure that that fold is at least covering the seam of the binding, so it gets caught in when I'm stitching in the ditch. You can also, I know a lot of pre-made bindings are one fold is larger than the other. And when I'm making my bias binding with my bias binding maker, you can, when you fold it in half, make sure that that fold, when you're pressing it, that center fold is just a skosh, so that your edges aren't, they don't meet, they are off a little bit. So those first folded edges are not, level. They're just one sticks out a little bit more, and you want to make sure that that edge that sticks out more is the edge that gets folded under. So you make sure you catch it when you're stitching in the ditch.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to say, I love that you threw in the way that quilters do it, because I've been trying to get you into the quilting world for, I feel like, years now, and I think I'm getting you there. So I love it. But so, I mean, we have videos of you making the continuous bias binding, even putting that on a project. You've also done a lot of videos for us on National Sewing Circle where you're making some sort of clothing or garment, so tank tops, and you're doing it out of knit fabric, and you do bind those neck edges. So if you want to see how she does it with a stretch fabric, so a little bit different of stitching, obviously you're going to use a zigzag stitch on that or a stretch stitch. We have those videos. But if you are more of the quilter side and you're looking specifically on how do I do that invisible hand stitch she mentioned, you can go to our sister site, nationalquiltercircle.com, and we have tons and tons of videos on how to bind quilts, both machine and hand stitching afterwards. So we kind of have all of your binding options and fabrics covered between the two sites. So that's perfect. Our next one here, Arlene wants to know, how come you have to iron your seams to set your seams?
So ironing your seams, I have heard people say that ironing your seams kind of sets your stitches. I always like to iron my seams. I like to press them open or press the seam allowances to one side or the other, just because it gives me a nice crisp look on the right side. Sometimes when you stitch your seam, it doesn't lay flat otherwise, and you get this weird like pocket type thing on your seam. So I've always got my iron out when I'm sewing. It's a super important part of making a crisp, professional looking finished product. And uh, I know I've heard, like I mentioned, I heard that people say it locks your stitches. I'm not sure how or why that works, but I just know that pressing your seams gives you a nice, clean, finished look.
Yeah.
That's why.
That's it. And that's definitely so setting your seams is another one of those. I think I've said it a million times during different quilting tutorials as well. So like as soon as you sew your two pieces of cotton fabric together, before you open it up, whether you're going to be sewing or pressing those seams to one side or open, you just hit it with your iron and just set it, and it sinks the thread down into the fabric a little bit, and yeah, it gives you the nice crisp press. So whether you're sewing or quilting, definitely something I would recommend doing. So Lynn says that she bought a new machine and she has made over 600 masks for our essential workers, which is awesome. Thank you for doing that. But now her reverse isn't working properly. Do you know what the reason could be?
Well, yes, 600 masks is incredible. That
Yeah.
is heroic, Lynn. Thank you. Um, so if your reverse isn't working properly, I would just recommend whenever anything isn't really working properly, if you get issues with tension or something just isn't quite right, it's not working quite right. I would try cleaning out your machine. 600 masks, that's a lot of sewing. That's a lot of
Mhm.
fabric that's going through a lot of lint, maybe that might get built up under your throat plate, in between your tension discs, and all of that can just throw off the timing of the machine. It can throw off the inner mechanisms working. So I would say give that a try. I'm sure you change your needle frequently if you're sewing that much. But a dull needle is a culprit of a lot of weird issues that can happen on a machine. Um, yeah, cleaning it out, um, making sure there's no lint gunking stuff up. Um, Yeah, I'd give that a shot first and just make sure everything else is working properly. And if it is only the reverse button that's not working, it might be just something inside of the machine that's not working, and it might need, a professional to take it apart and look at it. But yeah, that's my checklist for weird things that are happening: is clean the machine out, make sure you've got a nice fresh needle, you're using
Mhm.
the right type of thread with your fabric and the right type of thread with your needle. So give that a shot and
Yeah.
keep on trucking.
Yeah. Well, I say, I think too, especially if you're making obviously the masks out of cotton fabric, I think sometimes the amount of lint that cotton fabric and cotton thread and all that puts off is surprising. Like you don't think of it as one of those fabrics, like say you're sewing with, fleece or flannel and you are physically seeing all of that come off. More is going to come off of it than you think. So yeah, probably cleaning is your best
Yeah.
solution for that. Yeah. Rosanna wants to know, is it important to have an overlocker or can we finish edges with the sewing machine?
You can absolutely finish with a sewing machine. That's all I do. I don't have, I mean, I have a serger, but it's in the closet. So I don't have space to set it up in my sewing room. So it's more convenient for me to finish my edges on my sewing machine. And that's what I do in all of my videos for National Sewing Circle. If I'm finishing my edges, I just put the zigzag stitch on my machine and I just zigzag those edges.
Mhm.
Um, and that's my favorite way of finishing edges. It locks that edge in, it locks the threads from fraying. But I know my FOF passport has a bunch of overlock stitches, so there are a bunch of different options for you depending on what you like and what you're doing. um, but yeah, the zigzag stitch is just, it's functional, it's easy and quick. You can also pink and stitch is another one that I learned in college as an edge finisher, which is really easy. So you can just stitch your seam allowances separately, about a 1/4 inch from the raw edge, and then pink the edges. So stitch with a straight stitch and then pink the edges, and that locks in that edge from fraying as well. You can only pink the edge if you want. If you're using a nice stable cotton fabric, a lot of times that works just fine, just pinking the edges. Um, you can do some other edge finishes too if you have time. Um, You can do a flat felled seam, which is a nice strong seam, and it finishes your edges as well. So that one you can do it, you can, flat fill on the right side, which is what is, on your jeans a lot of times. The outside edges of your jeans are flat felled a lot of times, so you would stitch, if you want the seam finish on the right side, you would stitch with wrong sides together and trim one seam allowance down to about half, fold the other seam allowance by about half, I guess, and then press it over to the other side to encase your edges essentially, and then just edge stitch that edge. So it can be a cool like design detail kind of on the outside of your garment. You can do it on the inside as well. And it creates a really nice strong seam too, because it's essentially stitched twice. It takes a little bit more time, but it's cool. And there are a bunch of different edge finishes too. The Hong Kong edge is a nice clean finish, a lot of times seen in couture garments because it takes longer to do, but it also is a nice strong finish for your edges because they're bound. You're essentially binding each raw edge of your seam allowance. Yeah, but the zigzag stitch with your sewing machine is just fast and easy, and it does the job. And that's just what I always use.
Perfect. And I have to say, so we have videos on National Sewing Circle. You demonstrate the Hong Kong seam finish, and I have one demonstrating the flat felled. And I think you or me both have one demonstrating a French seam construction. So there's that one as well. But so one little thing that I wanted to mention with the zigzag, because you mentioned that a lot of machines have those, a bunch of overcast stitches to pick from. And so the one thing when I'm picking an overcast stitch, which I should have had a piece of paper so I could draw it, but it's going to look like a row of diamonds and then a straight line next to it, and that's usually what your overcast look like. But there's a thing called an overcast foot, and so if I hold this really, really close, I'm hoping you can see that there's this tiny little bar, right? Oh, there we go. Tiny little bar right there in the center, and that's what you're looking for on an overcast foot. And what that bar is going to do is when you're stitching, the needle is going to go from one side of that bar to the other side of that bar, and that will help keep your fabric laying flat. So if you've done zigzag stitching or overcast stitching on the edge and your fabric is always rolling in, that little bar kind of gives a little extra space to the thread so it will lay flat and then your seams won't roll up. So look for that overcast foot. This is the foot for my Viking machine, and it came standard with the machine. I'm pretty sure overcast feet do come standard with most sewing machines. If you have a quilting or embroidery specific machine, maybe not, but with most sewing machines they do. So look for that foot. Always fun to use the different feet that you have on your machine. All right, our next question here. How to sew a crocheted front of a pillow to a fabric as the back of the pillow.
So you have a crocheted front, so it's probably a little bit chunky, maybe open weave. So to keep that crocheted front stable, I would probably use some sort of stabilizer behind it. So so stabilizers. We've got stabilizer and we've got interfacing. They're two different things. So if you want to have a layer of something behind that crocheted front of the pillow for the life of the pillow, you can use interfacing. Interfacing comes in a whole bunch of different weights. I like either lightweight or featherweight interfacing because I'm normally putting it in collars and cuffs and stuff, and I want to stabilize the fabric without making it too stiff. So a lightweight or a featherweight interfacing is great for that. Comes in midweight and heavyweight, comes in fusible varieties and sew-in varieties that don't have the glue dots on the back. So there's different ones to choose from. I would probably do like a featherweight or a lightweight square of interfacing behind that crocheted front. You can baste the edges to hold it steady and stable, and then attach the back onto that way. If you want to if you don't want to have that layer of interfacing behind that crocheted layer for the life of the pillow, you can use something that machine embroiderers often use, which is a stabilizer that disappears after you use it. So machine embroiderers use it to hold the threads stable as they're laying down the threads in an embroidery design onto fabric. And then there's wash away stabilizer that washes away with water. You can, just wash the thing in the washer. You can dab it with a wet towel and the layer disappears. There's heat removable stabilizer, which comes in like this clear film variety. So it holds the thing stable as you're sewing it, and then you use your iron, give it a press, and it just like melts away. It just disappears. There's also cutaway stabilizer, which would just like interfacing, it would stay inside of that pillow, but it also would give stability to whatever you're sewing with. So depending on how you want it to end up, you've got a couple different varieties, but I would definitely want to stabilize that because anything crocheted is typically very movable, stretchy. So you want that to be set and not be stretching out of shape and out of grain as you are sewing it onto the back. So I would stabilize it with something first before attaching it to the back.
Yes, I 100% agree. And as someone who has like crocheted and knit both a pillow and then put a back on it and then put a pillow form or stuffing in it and then not realizing how open the design actually is. And it's not even so much that the stuffing or anything is going to come out of the pillow. It's not that. But generally, say you're using a pre-purchased pillow form, those are always white, right? Mm-hmm. And so you can every now and then just see through those, crochet or knit stitches, that white pillow form, which always kind of bugged me. So in addition to the stabilizing, I would probably even add fabric. Like I would just, whatever color coordinates with my pillow, I would put that behind there as well. So it looks pretty as well as, is going to hold up well.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. Giselle says her question is, what's the best brand of thread to use? I'm new to sewing and I was told to get the right thread, cotton, silk, etc. So it's kind of two different things, but I'll let you answer that.
Okay. So as far as the best brand, that is very subjective. It's like, what's the best brand of sewing machine? Everybody has their own opinions and their own loyalties. I usually just buy whatever thread brand matches my fabric best. Sometimes they just have slightly different dyes. So I just get, whatever matches my fabric best or whatever's on sale. I think they're typically very comparable in terms of quality. Coates and Clark and Gutermann are great threads. American and Eford is a good one. They're all pretty comparable. But as far as the right type of thread to use for like fiber content, that all depends on what you're making, how you're going to wash it, what you're using it for. So in general, you want to match your thread fiber content to your fabric fiber content. So if you are using 100% cotton thread, you, in theory, would want to use 100% cotton, or if you're using 100% cotton fabric, you'd want to use 100% cotton thread. Mm-hmm. However, all-purpose thread is a polyester core cotton wrapped thread, and like the name suggests, it is all-purpose. That's what I use 99% of the time, and it is great for knits, for when you're sewing on knits. Even if it's 100% cotton knit fabric, I always want to use all-purpose thread when I'm sewing with knits because it just has a little bit of extra give that 100% cotton thread does not. Cotton thread, if you can't stretch it. If you pull it to the end of its rope, it's going to snap. So even though when you're sewing on knits, you want to use a stretch stitch, that all-purpose thread just gives you like a safety net. If you get to the end of the stretch that you built into your seam, that all-purpose thread will just stretch a little bit more so you don't snap your seam.
Mhm.
But if you are sewing silk fabric, you definitely want to use silk thread. And the reason for matching those fiber contents is so that they will wash and wear the same. So sometimes, cotton thread might shrink a little bit in the wash. And if you're using a fabric that won't shrink with it or won't behave the same way that that thread does, you can have a little bit of dissonance between those fiber contents and it'll show up in your seam. Maybe in puckering of the seam, or just, the fabrics, the fiber contents don't like each other and it doesn't really want to sew well even. So, so matching your fiber contents can be important, especially when you are going to be washing and wearing or using the garment or the quilt a lot. If it is something that, like a home deck project or something that's going to get made and sit on a shelf and not washed, it's not as important. But if it's like a garment, it can be important. But like I said, all-purpose thread. If you're just starting out sewing, all-purpose thread, it's going to be fine. Also, another type of thread, rayon thread, a lot of times is great for if you're sewing very fine fabrics. So it's rayon thread kind of has a little bit of a sheen to it, but it's nice and fine. So it can be fun to use for like top stitching or decorative stitching. But yes, all-purpose thread, you'll be fine.
Yep. Absolutely. I also like all those brands. We all know that I love my thread. I always have every color possible. And I have a variety of all those brands you mentioned. And even when you're saying with the fiber content, another reason from sort of the how it's going to look aspect is silk fabric, obviously a little bit shiny, silk thread, a little bit shiny as well. So that way, your thread matches look wise your fabric as well. So I love it. I do want to say, so we're about halfway through. If you have questions, of course, still continue to ask those. Again, that's in the large chat box that is on your screen below the banner. And the banner I do want to talk about too, because if you are looking for something to do to keep yourself occupied while you're at home these days, we have some really fun coloring pages that you can download. So these are coloring pages that are health theme related and really fun that you can color by yourself with your kids. And also we have some other additional downloads with some sewing mazes. So we've talked a lot sometimes about using mazes to sort of practice sewing, practice turning corners, angles, use that with your kids. So we've actually put together some of those mazes too. So we have all these fun things you can download. And of course, that's what the banner is near that chat box where you should be entering your questions for Nikki. So continuing on with some more questions here, Linda says, if you're doing applique on a single thickness of material, do you need to use a paper backing or something else to prevent puckering?
So when you're doing applique, a lot of times the fusible web is enough to stabilize the fabric. So the fusible web is, I believe it comes in one-sided and double-sided fusible, maybe.
Well,
Um,
one-sided fusible is essentially just interfacing, but
right.
double-sided fusible would be but it
Actually,
does come in different thicknesses, like interfacing, lightweight, medium weight, heavyweight.
yeah. Applique, I've done applique projects, but a long time ago. So I'm not like huge on applique. Ashley probably does applique more than I do. But what I know about applique, fusible web is the tool that's used for applique. It's great because you can trace on it, I believe,
Mhm.
and cut out your shapes. You fuse your applique fabric onto it, and then you can fuse the other side onto your fabric that you're appliquing onto. So it just makes it super easy. Then you stitch your edges, and it stabilizes it. If you're doing So if you're applying onto a fabric that is kind of thin and needs stabilization, you might, want to use some interfacing or stabilizer on the wrong side of that.
Mhm.
Uh, but Ashley probably has more applique tips.
Well, I say I do a lot of applique, but it's normally in on quilts. So I'm appliquing 100% cotton fabric onto 100% cotton fabric. So I've never had an issue with puckering. But yes, heat and bond is or fusible web. Those are definitely a product that you want to use. I don't know that I've ever done applique without it. Obviously you can, but I mean it's just like you mentioned. It has a paper side and it has a glue side. You can draw your design right onto it, fuse it onto the back of your applique shape, then fuse your applique shape onto your background so you don't need any pins. So for me, it's always like a why would I not want to use it situation. So that's why I like to use it. And then, yeah, I've never had an issue with any puckering. If you are having puckering issues, it could be not necessarily the fabric you're using, but actually the stitch that you're using. So I like to do a blanket stitch, which is where you're going around the outside edge and then it takes a bite into your shape and back out. And normally your machine will automatically, set a stitch length for that. So you'll do anywhere between 2 and 4 straight stitches and then 1 in. If you make that way too narrow and your stitch density is like those stitches are almost right on top of one another and you're using, say, an all-purpose or 100% cotton thread that is a little bit heavier, then your thread, the amount of thread you're putting around that shape is going to be what's puckering, not necessarily anything wrong with your fabric or your sort of prep of your applique. So just lengthen those out a little bit or leave them at the machine setting and not make them smaller, and you shouldn't have any puckering issues. Amy would like to know, what is the best sewing machine for beginners?
So I love talking about questions like this because it leads to all I can branch out and talk for a long time. So the best sewing machine, when we're talking about the best anything in sewing, is very subjective. Like with thread, it's very much based on your opinions and what you have used in the past. The best sewing machine for beginners, a lot of times, is one that is kind of simple, not a huge overhead cost, so that you can go in different directions with your sewing if you want as you grow in your skills and your confidence. So, my first sewing machine was a Brother machine. My first two sewing machines actually were Brother machines. And I think I started on the Brother CS 6000i, which was, very cheap by comparison. It was like $80 or something. So for a poor college kid, super affordable. And that's the machine that I really learned to sew on and I started sewing on. And it had everything that I needed. The controls were easy, easy to learn how to use. It had a zigzag stitch and a buttonhole stitch and a straight stitch. And I'm a garment sewer typically, so that was kind of all I needed. Um, so it was, since it was cheaper, it was, made out of plastic. So it was lighter weight, which was kind of nice. I could take it out of my closet and set it up where I needed to and take it down without too much hassle. I never had any problems with that machine. Now that I know more and I've grown more in sewing, I'm glad that I have an upgraded machine because that little machine couldn't do some of the things that I do now, like heavier weight fabric or a lot of layers of fabric or some of the cool things that my machine can do now. Um, so all of that being said, um, when you're looking for a machine, if you can test drive a couple different machines, that's awesome. That's a really good way to get a feel for the machine and if it's comfortable for you to work on. And like all machines, it's going to take you some getting used to learn how to use it. So it's not going to be maybe not going to be super intuitive the first time you sit down at it. But for a beginner, I would not recommend like a really complex machine. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. But I like the manual button even still. But for a beginner, I can imagine it being a little bit overwhelming to have all those different options and having to, go in to different folders on your machine screen and try and figure things out. So very simple functionalities are good for a beginner. I'm brand loyal to this beauty sitting next to me. The FOF, I love the integrated dual feed foot that it has. That's just a little walking foot that is basically attached to the back of the presser foot, and you can just pull it down and attach it under the foot, and you've got a walking foot, which I always have engaged. It's super useful. So I love FOF. I know different sewers have different brand loyalties and will recommend you different things, but that simple functionality and low overhead cost, personally, I think would be good for a beginner.
Yep, I agree. I don't necessarily have the brand loyalty like you do. I also started out on a Brother machine, purchased a very inexpensive one in college as well. But I learned how to sew on my mom's Singer machine. I now have the Viking Epic 980Q, which I absolutely love, and I know you say, simple functionality for a beginner is a good thing, and I do agree with that. Aside from price point, I would not necessarily, suggest this for a beginner unless you know that you're going to get into this and not, just use it a couple times and set it aside. But the thing about like a machine like the Epic 980Q is that it does a lot of auto things for you. So if you're unsure, how do I set my tension, or how should I set up my machine for a specific stitch or a project, this machine just does it for you. You just go in and you say, I want to sew a zipper. This machine will even play you a little video tutorial on how to sew a zipper. So like there is, a benefit to having a machine like that, especially like I said, you need extra help or want extra help with things like that. Also, you mentioned your dual feed foot, which is great. I actually have a FOF that I've sewn on too, and I use that all the time. And then sort of I don't want to say equivalent, but the thing that helps with on this Viking machine that's similar is it has I forget the exact acronym for it, but it will sense your layers. So it will, if you're going over just one layer and then you have some trim or something where you have extra thickness, and it will just sort of automatically adjust and sense what you're sewing over and make those adjustments so you're always getting even stitches. So love basic functionality machines, but love super computerized, can sew pretty much for me machines also.
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect. All right. This question is perfect for you, right up your alley. Jessica wants to know how to attach an elastic type of fabric to a spandex type of fabric.
Okay, so an elastic type of fabric. So spandex fabric is a stretchy fabric essentially, and spandex, you can have spandex blended into the threads of a woven fabric, but a lot of times spandex is constructed in a knit construction to give maximum stretchiness. So if you are attaching um, elastic so an elastic type of fabric to a spandex type of fabric. So when you're attaching different types of fabric to each other, you want to use the tools and the thread for your most finicky or fussiest fabric. So if I was attaching spandex fabric to like a woven fabric, which I have done, I would use a needle and thread so that my knit or my spandex fabric would be the most comfortable. So if you're attaching elastic to spandex, luckily I would use the same tools for elastic and spandex anyway. So since they're both stretch, they need to have a lot of stretch in them, or stretch built into seams. I would use all-purpose thread for sure, and I would use a spandex needle. So there are needles that are constructed specifically for use on stretch fabrics. So you have your ballpoint needle, your jersey needle, and your spandex needle. And all of those are good for use on knit fabrics or stretch fabrics. They're constructed so the tip of the needle isn't, super pointy and sharp. It's slightly rounded at the tip so that it won't cut through the fibers of your knit or stretch fabric and create runs. You can, I know some people do and it's fine. You can use an all-purpose needle on those fabrics, but a needle that is built for those fabrics will just help increase the life of the what you're creating, the life of the fabric. It'll just treat the fabric better and make it last longer. So a spandex needle is designed specifically for spandex fabric. So that would be a good thing to use there. And when you are stitching stretchy fabrics, it's important when your needle or when your fabric is going under the presser foot, you don't want it to stretch as it's going under the presser foot, because you don't want, if you stretch your fabric as the seam is getting laid in the fabric, then when that fabric relaxes, you're going to have too much thread in your seam and then you're going to have a wavy seam. So to avoid stretching the fabric as you're stitching, you can do a couple things. So you can decrease the presser foot pressure. Some machines don't allow you to do that, but if you can, I highly recommend it. I can do it on my FOF. There's just a little knob on the top, the plus and a minus. So turn it, more toward the minus, and it just won't smash down on the fabric quite as much. So if you're stitching, you're stitching knit fabric or any fabric that has stretch, that can help. A walking foot can help feed both of those layers at the same time. So a lot of times you'll get, shifting with knit and stretch fabrics as well. So yeah, just using the right tools and making sure that fabric doesn't stretch as you're stitching it. Those are my main tips.
Yeah, perfect. All right, Susan wants to know, do you know if there is an easy way or a tool to thread the machine and needle for somebody with failing vision?
Yeah, so if a lot of machines will have an automatic needle threader, which is super great. I use mine all the time. And it's just like a little lever next to your needle. So when you're threading your needle, you pull that lever down and it kind of punches your thread through your needle for you, which is super great. If you don't have one of those on your machine, there are those, I probably don't have one right here, but it's a lot of times they come on the end of a seam ripper. It's just that little needle threader thing. It's a little wire loop that you push through the needle and thread the thread through and pull it out. Those can be, it might be kind of hard to see those too because they're so thin and small, but that's the only tool I can really think of for threading. I'm sure you could probably search for, needle threading for poor vision. And I know sewing is a huge industry and it's been around for a really long time. So I'm sure the bright minds have invented something that can help, I hope.
Yes, and yeah, I think you are correct. We actually even have a video on National Sewing Circle. ZJ Humbach did a fun one for us where she shows some different types of needle threaders. So the one you're talking about with that little wire loop, one that's not necessarily for your machine, it's more for a hand sewing needle, but you just put the needle down into this little contraption, hit a button, and it threads the needle for you. She also talks about, using things like beeswax and thread heaven and chapstick even, like to just sort of make sure the tip of the thread that you're going to be threading through that needle isn't fraying. It's going to go through there easily. So some additional tips there as well if you want some more for threading your needle. But now a question here from Cheryl. When stitching vinyl for bags, what determines the weight load?
Oh, vinyl for bags. I'm not sure. That's a good question. I guess so. You can tell me if you interpreted this differently, Ashley.
Okay, I will.
So, to figure out, I guess, how much weight you can put in your bag. So, If you're
Mhm.
going to be using that vinyl bag for like going to the grocery store or something and loading up with canned goods, you want that bag to be super strong and sturdy, and you don't want your seams to break if you load that bag with a lot of heavy stuff. So um, to make that bag super strong, you can use maybe not simply a straight stitch. So you can use, like we were talking about, a flat felled seam, even when you're stitching your bag together to make those seams super strong, flat felt seam. Or you can use a triple stitch, which is, it's a stretch stitch because it adds, a stretch to a stitch, but it also kind of help reinforce a seam. So the triple stitch is 2 stitches forward and 1 stitch back. So it just
Mhm.
kind of locks your stitches in, and can, create a stronger seam. And uh, attaching your handles to your bag is definitely, that's a huge stress point on your bag. You want the attachment of the handles to the bag to be super, super strong. So when you're attaching your handles to the bag, you want to use, or I always use like a box. So, put the handle on, stitch a box instead of just like, stitching one line of stitching along the lower edge. Stitch a box and even stitch an X inside of the box to really, really lock that handle onto your bag and make it super duper strong.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, sometimes we're like really far apart in how we interpret questions, but I feel like we were kind of on the same page there. The only
Yeah.
thing that I thought about that was a little bit different is that if I know that I'm going to, be putting a bunch of stuff in this vinyl bag, then I'm going to pick a super thick, heavy duty vinyl versus,
Mhm.
because vinyl does come in weights, much like other fabrics. So you can get a lightweight to a heavyweight. So I would definitely pick the heavyweight. And then just another fun additional video. I believe it's actually on our sister site, National Quilter Circle. I could be wrong. I might have to research this one and post it in the comments. But we have one on actually attaching using like webbing, vinyl or nylon webbing for handles. Not saying you have to do this for this bag specifically. It's more of the actual technique that she used when she was attaching the handles, to where it is one long, really long strip of this webbing. And so the handle, comes up and is a handle on one side, goes down underneath the bag, up handle on the other side, and then connects. So that's even like extra support on the bottom of the bag because it's, all one piece. So kind of just the tips that you mentioned, and just thinking through sort of the construction of how you attach the main stress point of that bag, like you mentioned. Perfect. So I do want to have sort of a fun question to end it on here, but I do want to say, of course, I want to talk about our little banner again real quick. If you missed me talking about that a little bit ago, if you're looking for some really fun sort of activity pages, things to do for yourself, for your kids, you can click the banner we have below the video and download some coloring pages, quilt block coloring pages, sewing mazes. So if you want to teach your kids how to sew, straight lines, curves, turning corners, all of that, you can download all these activity pages. But to wrap it up, Janet wants to know, what are some projects you are working on right now?
Well, I have not gotten to 600 masks, but I am, of course, working on masks. I've made, I think, 25 so far, so I have a ways to go to catch up. But yeah, just masks for, I've stitched some for the hospital in my town, some for a friend of mine whose mom is a nurse in Virginia, and just masks for friends and family. So yeah, it's actually a really great project for using up scraps. If you have scraps of fabric that are that nice tight weave that are good for masks,
Yeah.
it's a good fabric. And like I mentioned, I finished my daughter's curtains.
Okay.
And since she is, at home all the time now, not in school, I've started taking her in my sewing room with me and trying to do some projects with her. She loves picking out fabric from my stash. I've got 2 totes of fabric, and I've got them all very nicely organized, except for when she goes up there to pick fabric for a project. It's like everything comes out at once. But
Mhm.
it's super fun, and I actually downloaded those coloring pages that you were talking about. One of them is it says best teacher ever, and my daughter colored that for her teacher, who's we're doing distance learning now, and it's a whole new thing for for us and for my daughter's kindergarten teacher. So we were showing our appreciation for a teacher with that coloring page and those sewing mazes too. I think we're gonna try that next time I take her up in my sewing room. She's gonna be super excited because she loves driving the sewing machine. So we'll get started on teaching her how to sew.
Perfect. So you got the driving down. Now you just got to teach her the steering part, and then you'll be good to go. She can make all her own projects.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thank you so much for being here to answer everyone's sewing questions and talk all things sewing as usual. And we'll love to have you back again next month for another live Q&A session. So thank you so much.
Thank you.